Hello, everybody. Nick the Tiro here. Before we get into this chapter dealing with authentication, identity and access management, I want to start this chapter with a why. Why has this become so prevalent in our lives? Now, you might be thinking Nick's a little silly here asking this question, why? Well, by understanding why, we can understand the progression things have taken. For example, 40 years ago, when I was in college, I had one account for that college. If I needed access into the mainframe, they gave me one account. I forgot what it was, but one account and one password. That was it. Not a lot of sophistication there. It's still the same now, but what has changed in those 40 years? Well, the sheer quantity of accounts that we're managing. I now have around 200 accounts to deal with. All right, so that's one thing. The sheer quantity involved. But also 40 years ago, if I wanted access to the computer system, I went to Cleveland State. If I wanted access to the computer system, I physically had to be there on campus. And on campus, they only had maybe 10, 15 computer rooms. And in each computer room, they maybe had 20 to 30 terminals. So they probably had like 400 to 500 terminals spread out for student use throughout the campus. It was completely controlled. It was a private, wasn't even a network, but it was a private environment. They controlled everything from the terminal to the mainframe. We weren't using servers back then. The ability to hack into it wasn't that great. You'd be splicing wires. They were getting so the overall structure associated with Cleveland State 40 years ago was normal for most organizations. There were a couple modems, right? And the modem technology back then was 300 baud. It was extremely slow. You had to be a junior to have access to the modem. And all that did was allow you to connect into computers from home. So even that was somewhat controlled. So what changed? A lot changed in 40 years. First of all, you don't have to be physically at a location to use their computer system. We now routinely connect into computer systems from all over the world. Then we have this really massive thing that we call the internet that basically got turned, it's been around since the 1960s, but basically got turned on in the late 80s, early 90s for private use. So you and I, well, the internet is one big giant party line. Everybody's using the internet. If we don't have some kind of security associated with the communication over the internet, anybody can listen to our knowledge. And more, or if not all of our data, all of our private data is being stored somewhere with some ability to access it from someplace else using the internet as our backbone. So guess what? Now, instead of one account 40 years ago, I got 200 accounts with 200 different passwords, and I have to have a password manager to that. I'm no longer physically constrained by having to physically go to a location to connect to the computer. I'm using the internet. Any connection over the internet, that's a big giant party line. I need that communication to be secure, not just during the communication, but through the authentication process. So if we look at the chapter, and let's kind of just spin through some of the things in the first part of the chapter, we can understand why. We can look at it and say, who would ever think of that, right? Well, we do think about that. We as IT people, we have to think about the past so we know where we're going. So a lot of times, not just where we're going, so we can improve. There might be some old technology out there. So give me a second. Let me get up my screen. It's being a little slow here. We'll start with different methods. And I don't want to go through and read the chapter to you or anything like that. I'm assuming you guys know how to read. It's not adult story hour. But let's take a look at the chapter. Give it a second to fire up on my computer. And why do we have this now? Well, because there's so many of us using it, because our private information is up there, we got to be very, very protective. And there's different methodologies to be very protective. If we just go back to the days of a single password. And 40 years ago, your password could have been anything as long it was, I think it was as long as 8 characters. So we used to use dictionary words all the time. I think I used the same password at Cleveland State for about 4 years, and then I went to work and I used the same password, and it was not sophisticated. It wasn't upper and lower and stuff like that. And what do we discover? We can't do that anymore. We have to sophisticate our passwords, have upper and lower and special characters. But what about these other authentication methods of using one-time passwords? We're seeing more and more of those. Just recently, I was installing YouTube TV on my system, and they were connecting, and they provided a one-time password for my account. So when I was, both on the TV and on my phone, it was asking for that password that was generated by Google, and it was gone. After I was done using that. So they're basically going through a lot of these situations. They're going through giving you that password, expecting it to be gone, and the security is, go ahead, give that password away. It's good. It's not just a one-time, it's a one-time use. What are some of the other things, some of these authentication tools that we use on a phone? Now, what's really interesting to me about the authentication with the phone is we all carry our phone around with us, and there is so much encryption and everything on our phone to make the communication that they're relying upon these different devices to encrypt and verify who we are. I've used the Microsoft and the Google authentication on my phone a couple times. Now Google has something really interesting. They've been doing it for a couple of years. When I was installing YouTube TV on my TV, a little app on my TV, at a certain point, it gave me a QR code. I had to go in there, and it gave me a one-time password. But then what was really interesting, to verify that it was me doing all this, it said, go to your YouTube app, not YouTube TV app, go to your YouTube app, launch it. And when I launched it, the first thing it says was, hey, somebody's trying to access your account, right? Is that you? And I said, yep, that's me. And that put all the verification process in there. So these are nice little approaches, and we have the keys and all this other wonderful stuff. And again, read the chapter. Biometric I covered in a other video. Again, to me, the issue with biometrics is we have to give up some of our privacy. We have to actually program our privacy into some kind of accounts database. Now, it's not really part of this chapter. We talk about it in other chapters, but your password. And I bring it up with the password authentication protocol. It was one of the first authentication protocols to verify your password and username, but it was written, I want to say it was written in the 70s or 80s. And if you look on it, PAP does not encrypt your username or your password. It would send it over clear text. But again, think about 40 years ago. You were on an isolated network. Maybe you were on a modem. People weren't tapping into the modem. It wasn't a big giant party line like we see with the internet. So sending a username and password clear text was not that significant of an issue unless you put a device, and we used to do this as practice, you would put a device between the terminal and the computer, and you would see all the traffic there. It's not used too much anymore. You might come across it with some very old legacy systems, but you're probably looking back at least 30, 40 years. CHAP, uses secret keys passing, re-authenticates. It's not talked about much in this chapter, but I want to talk about passwords. Are passwords ever sent over most of the technology nowadays? No, passwords are not sent over most of the technology. Most of the authentication processes do not use or allow the passwords to cross, even if you are on the same physical network as your server. Actually, your password doesn't even cross. Say when you log into your own personal computer and you got to give it a password, your password is never sent to the kernel. It's never sent to the security apparatus of your computer in clear text. What it does is it hashes a value of your password with a salt, and there's a whole bunch of things, and it passes that hash value to the security accounts database. If I was to ever open up a security accounts database, I can't look up passwords on most new systems now. You can't look up a password on most new systems. That is why if you forget your password, they can't send you your old password. You have to reset it, because they can't look up your old password. Now, years ago, even up to maybe 10 years ago, they would send you your old password and say, here's your old password, you're fine. And that was a dangerous practice, because that would tell you that that password was in the security accounts database, and that was easily corruptible, or what do you call it? Easily compromised. So for a while, we don't send the passwords over anything. They're not stored anywhere. It's just that every time you type that password, a hash value is created with a saltine or a seed. They send that hash value over to the security accounts database, and they basically say, hey, does this hash value match the hash value that you have? Now, some people say, can you steal the hash value over the wire? It's a one-time hash, and it has some kind of salt in there. So you steal all you want. It's meaningless at a certain point. But one of the things with CHAP is no more. CHAP's fairly old too. It's probably been around 30 years, but got rid of the encryption. I'm sorry, kept the encryption, got rid of the clear text. Again, 40 years ago, it didn't make a difference. Now it makes a considerable difference. And let's talk about Kerberos. And the reason we bring up Kerberos a lot of time is because it is the authentication protocol that is used in Microsoft. And you can read this, but basically what this is you have a client, and somewhere on your network, you have a key distribution center. In Microsoft, they call that the domain controller. And you basically authenticate through that key distribution center, right? Through the domain controller. Now, here's where life gets a little confusing for a lot of people. You're not really logging in to this server here. Let's call this the domain controller. You're not logging into the server. All you're doing is you're authenticating, you are proving who you are to the server, and they send you a service token, right? Oh, okay, we recognize you as Nick. We're going to send you a token. Now, if you go to any other server on your network, you just supply them this token. Now, the token is only as good as long as you're logged in. The moment you log out, the token goes away. So if somebody was to steal your token, or you were to change some of your credentials and then relog in, you get a whole brand new token. That's why a lot of times in a Microsoft environment, if they're having problems, one of the first things that a network administrator will tell you to do is log off, log back on. And that's not a cop-out. What that basically does is, by logging out, you're destroying the previous service token. It goes away. It's not managed or kept anywhere. And when you log in, a new token is created. So this is a pretty secure method of authentication into networks. This bodes very well when, in other videos, we'll talk about single sign-ons and things like that. But this is a nice technique because the authentication is done up front. All your security establishments, who you are, what you are, your role and stuff like that are established up front. You're given a token, and then you go about your business. If at any time your security needs to change or they need to improve it, then they improve it and they tell you to log off and log back on, and that creates that whole new token. So it's been used quite frequently in a lot of distributions. The big one that is used is in Microsoft's Active Domain. Why do we need all this stuff? Well, again, think about your own personal environment. You may have a couple of accounts. Do you want them to be compromised? So we have to protect the information. We have to protect the information in transit. We have to protect the information at rest. Where's it being stored? When we talk about data, we often talk about data in transit or at rest or in storage. And what they mean by storage is archived. It's gone someplace else. And when it comes to personal private information, when we're talking about authentication factors, passwords and things like that, we don't want that stuff stored anywhere. That's not a good approach. But we have to be careful about when we're using those factors. We don't want to compromise those. We got to be careful about how they're getting stored. We don't store passwords. We just got talking about that. And this all came about because this stuff has become so ubiquitous. We rely upon the internet for all our communications now. It's our backbone. It's the communication backbone. If you are using any kind of Wi-Fi, a phone Wi-Fi, It's going over the internet. This communication here, going over the internet. The days of modems, the old-fashioned modems where you would dial in, they're still out there, and we'll touch briefly on them in other videos. But so much of our communication is reliant upon the internet because the internet is everywhere. And we have billions of devices out there, and we have hundreds of accounts that we have to get to. So as you're going through these chapters, this particular chapter, just don't kind of go through it, but ask your question, why? Why has this really just has taken off? Then you factor in, all the exploits that have occurred and things like that. So begin to ask yourself the question, why? That being said, let's go and learn something.